Today we are going to talk about what is probably the single most refined technique in all of fencing, the thrust. Normally I would relate this technique specifically to Longsword, simply because that is the weapon I have the most experience with, but the more I think about it, the more I realize that these are not just longsword techniques. These are universal concepts that can be applied across a wide range of weapons, and they can be found in many different manuscripts from different traditions. Whether we are talking about the longsword, saber, rapier or sword and buckler, these techniques work across all of them, because the theoretical foundation of sword fencing does not really change. So today we are going to look at the first of 3 thrusting techniques and how we can apply it in a fight. And yes, I will be using techniques from German fencing manuscripts for this. And before you rush to the comments to tell me that I have no idea what I'm talking about and other traditions do other things completely differently, lean back and hear me out first. Because no matter how you look at it, there are really only 3 categories of thrusts in fencing, and they are universal applicable. So let's not waste any more time and jump straight into it. For years I have mainly worked with 3 types of thrusts. A direct thrust, a defensive thrust and a structure breaking thrust. I did not come up with these categories myself. The concepts behind them come from manuscripts. So today I'm going to do something that usually plays a secondary role on this channel. I'm actually going to bring ideas from the manuscripts to help explain the concepts from different angles. If you want to study this technique more closely, it is absolutely worth it looking into the manuscripts 44A8 by Peter von Danzig. That is the source I will be using as a support today. Even though the techniques described there are longsword techniques, they are working perfectly well for other weapons too. Personally, I am a big fan of the idea that you should take one weapon as a foundation, master it properly, and then transfer those principles to other weapons. Even though some people in the Hema community have a quite other idea about this, I think swords are swords, and in the end they work all the same way. Or to put it in the words of Joachim Meyer, the sword is the foundation of all fencing. And with the sword, of course, he meant the longsword. Back then, this specific term just wasn't really a thing. Because this topic is quite extensive, I'm turning it into a 3-part series. So if you don't want to miss the other 2 types of thrusts, make sure to subscribe. But enough theory, let's look at the first thrust. The first thrust we are going to look at is the direct thrust. This is the fastest way to hit your opponent. You simply extend your arm straight forward and make yourself as long as possible. By doing that, you maximize your reach and you can catch your opponent by surprise. Now this thrust does have one major weakness. It does not really protect me. My hands are exposed, my head is not fully covered, and it is relatively easy for someone to strike over the parry. So why would you use such a vulnerable thrust at all? Very simple. I use it whenever I know that my opponent cannot hit me. You could also bring the Roosset aspect here, but let's leave that aside for now. Let me give you an example. In this example, my opponent is standing in a very deep fluke. It is a guard that protects them very well against all kinds of hand hits, at the same time leaves the upper opening exposed. This is a tactic I've seen many times. Usually the idea is that if your strike comes from above, they can step out of the danger zone with footwork and attack the hands. Or maybe throw a geisel or a one-handed thrust. In other words, they defend themselves by moving out of range and hitting into the preparation. The reason this example works so well is that I can use the angle of my thrust to hit them without being hit myself, because I have more reach in that moment. And before anyone comments that this only works because I'm tall, in this example my opponent is as tall as myself. That is exactly why it works well as an example. But this principle is nothing new to anyone who has actually handled source material before. This concept appears both in rapier manuscripts as also in German tradition. Among the other places, the manuscript 44A8 contains exactly this idea in a piece on the Schielhau. If you stand before him with the sword at your right shoulder and he stands before you in fluke, intending to thrust at you from below, then strike long with the Schielhau above against him. At the same time, thrust the point long into his chest. In this way, he cannot reach you with the thrust. Even though this thrust is not itself a shield how, the concept behind it is exactly the same. The same principle can also be found in the shuttle how, to break the elbow. You strike as high as possible that your opponent cannot hit your hands. What is important here is that you also put a certain degree of explosiveness into the thrust, so that your opponent cannot escape. In general, the flashing of the motion is extremely important. Even if the technique is theoretically on your side, if you are too slow, it will not help you. The same principle also works with other weapons. If there is no direct threat present, you can attack the upper body with almost no risk. In this example, you can see the opponent is not presenting any direct threat. Neither is the point threatening me, nor are there any guards like from Tark that is immediately set up to a strike. We both disengage from the situation and my opponent is still trying to recover. In doing so, they create an opening that allows me to thrust safely. Here I choose the direct thrust because it offers the most reach and is extremely fast. The direct thrust is especially useful whenever my opponent is not expecting it. In exactly those moments, you can use the chaos of the situation to land the thrust. Once again, the goal is to get the maximum out of the reach. For this example, let's look at the opponent's move. For this thrust to work, your opponent needs to be moving in the opposite direction of the movement they would need in order to parry the thrust. I know, sounds complicated, so let me explain it more simply. To parry a thrust, you usually need some combination of a lateral movement and an upward movement. Of course, there are also index actions, but for now, let's just focus on the movement itself. Let's say my opponent is standing in Plug or in some kind of Longsword guard. If I try to thrust to the right side, they would need to push my blade sideways or upwards in order to defend. That means the direction of the parry are fairly clear. So for the thrust to work, I need to provoke them into making a move in exactly the opposite direction. That means if my opponent changes guard into from Tark to Alba, for example, their movement is the opposite to the one they would need in order to displace my thrust. So if I launch my action at exactly that moment, they have to stop one motion and begin another one. And in this short moment, I gain a speed advantage. Exactly the same principle appears in the Durchwechsel chapter of Peter von Danzig. As described in the manuscript, it is done whenever my opponent tries to bind or displace my blade. If I know that is what he wants to do, I change through. The same idea applies here. I take advantage of the moment when the blade is moving the wrong way in order to gain a tempo advantage. What that means in practice is, by the time their movement comes to a stop, I'm already at full speed, and by the moment their blade finally meets mine, I have already landed the hit. So I can either create this moment through a feint, or I can wait until my opponent changes their guard. For me personally, it has always worked best when my opponent let their guard drop. That brief instant is often enough to land the hit. And if we now remember what we have discussed in the first example, we are also protecting ourselves against a counteraction. So let's remember, the direct thrust works when: first, the opponent guard is lower than mine; second, there is no direct threat from the blade; and third, the opponent is making a movement opposite to the displacement they would need to defend. But what if my opponent is attacking me? Or what if there is a danger or an afterblow? That is exactly where the second thrust comes in. But that will be a topic for the next time.